Welcome to On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is Kevin Powell. Kevin Powell is a poet, journalist, filmmaker, and human rights activist. His most recent book is Grocery Shopping with My Mother, published by Source Skull Press. How are you doing this morning, Kevin?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Kevin, before you share with us the title poem of your new book, I'd like for you to comment on the influence of two other black women on your life. Tell us something about your aunt, Catherine Powell, and your grandmother, Lottie Burson Powell.
Oh, wow. Well, my grandmother was the matriarch of the family, like so many of our families. And my whole family's from South Carolina. I believe your family's from South Carolina as well. Is that right?
No, no, no. My family is actually from the West Indies,
Oh, what country? I got it.
Barbados, and Panama, and also my father's born in Panama.
Oh, wow. You know
Okay.
what? I just got you confused with another writer, and Barbados is actually my spiritual home. I've been to Barbados more than any Caribbean island. I didn't realize that. Wow.
See, that's
Wow.
why we're brothers, Kevin.
That's right. And then there was a
But
lot of back and forth between Barbados and the Carolinas, as I'm sure you know. But
right.
my grandmother could not read or write, but she was an amazing storyteller and really the person that tried to hold the family together. And as you know, be it the migration of folks from the Caribbean, Latin America, or from the American South, there's a deep, deep, deep history of our family connections and trying to make sure we hold on to the memories. And she was a keeper of memories, I would say that. And the
Hmm.
same with my Aunt Catherine, my mother's youngest sister. She's important because when I was a much younger writer, young poet, as you know, I wrote a poem for her that I included in this book called For Aunt Catherine, just about her traumas and mental health issues. And thankfully, she's okay and she's still with us and, living in Jersey City, my hometown, the same senior building as my mother. But, women have been important to my life, just like you've written about. I remember you talking about your mother visiting her nursing home. These are stories that we have to tell, and they've been very important for me. And I realized how much I was listening to their kitchen conversations as I was growing up because those stories stuck with me.
Hmm. Well, I know you have a long poem to your aunt in the anthology In the Tradition, which you edited with Ross Baraka back in 1992. But when you look at African American women in literature, Kevin, are there any writers who you feel best tell their stories?
Zora Neale Hurston, it's really interesting you asked the question. I've been watching in pieces because it's so compelling to me, the new PBS documentary on Zora Neale Hurston. I didn't know that Black people wrote books until I got to college. I know that sounds crazy,
Hmm.
but unfortunately, you're blessed to be in a generation where you were exposed to all the great stuff that was happening in America around civil rights and the Black arts movement. And it's sad, but unless you had a teacher or a mentor or a parent or parents who exposed you to that, you didn't get it. I grew up loving reading. I loved Shakespeare. I thought I was Edgar Allan Poe as a high schooler. I really believed that I was Edgar Allan Poe. But I did not know that people of color wrote books until I got to college. Dr. Cheryl Wall, rest in peace, at Rutgers University, had a Harlem Renaissance class, and it was there that I was introduced to Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. And particularly when I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, that's the book that did it for me. It remains my favorite novel to this day. But just, I was brought up, we were ashamed of Geechee Gullah. We were ashamed of Creole and Patois, the dialects that our people speak, depending on where we come from in the diaspora. And that book gave me permission to say, okay, I now realize that my mother's way of speaking is actually beautiful poetry. That's what started it for me.
Hmm. Well, why don't you share with our listeners Grocery Shopping with My Mother, which is your title poem of your new collection?
The whole thing?
Yeah, the whole thing.
um, Grocery shopping with my mother. Dear God, please do not take my mother from me anytime soon. I am not ready. I do not know what I would be without her. She has been my mother and my father since she pushed and pulled me through her earth the way a jagged little pill shoved its way around the mouth of history. I love my mother like I love breathing air, even when she bruises me with her words, with her rage. My mom has forever bruised me with her words, with her rage. Was a horribly lonely only child, I did not understand why she behaved as she did. But when she got sick, really sick, a few years back, I was terrified of losing my mother. I had her speed dial to the hospital there in Jersey and sprinted me as fast as I could to be with her. Ma said it was the first time she had been in a hospital since she had given birth, and there she was, flailing like a caught fish on a frosty metal table in an off-white hospital gown. Her belly had swelled so big, it looked like she was pregnant with me another time. And that is how it began. Our regular trips to the grocery store. because Ma could not move without immense pain, without waddling like a penguin in the middle of a summer hurricane. Dear God, my mother knows not what that. Dear God, my mother does not know that I often walk behind her on purpose as she grabs a pound of hamburger, a bag of sugar, a loaf of bread, a box of cereal. Aisle after aisle, my heart spills a bucket of suds. Aisle after aisle, my eyes spill 2 buckets of suds like that day she slid as a baseball runner would onto the floor in her senior apartment from her favorite chair. And it took my entire back strength, my mother's plump frame, to get her up to her recliner. And before I could, there we were, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. Her on the floor, me on the floor. We stared at each other, as we may have stared at each other when I was a scared baby and her a scared young woman. And in that very moment, I wanted to tell my mother what she meant to me, but could not because my mother and I have never hugged, have never kissed, have never said, I love you. And here I was, the caretaker of a person who did not care to be touched by anyone. 3, dear God, my mother's legs throb bad. Ma religiously rubs ointments on them like she is scrubbing grime from her bathtub. She repeatedly refers to herself as being sick. She says she's an old woman. She says she's tired, so tired. She prays to you, God, from can't see to can't see. She says you will work a supernatural miracle and heal her body, Lord. She says blood of Jesus each chance she thinks of it, like Jesus fixing to be Superman and jump off that prickly cross. My mother's altar is the shopping cart at the supermarket. She baptizes the handle with one of her wipes. She cusses at me when I ask her to pull her mask over her nose. She smushes her worn black purse into the child seat where I once drooped my skinny legs. She clutches tight the cart, says it helps her balance. Ma is afraid to fall. Ma ain't going to fall in front of no strangers. My mother's power is in the steering of the shopping cart. She pushes it forward the way a truck driver inches their tractor through the bumper-to-bumper traffic. She wobbles slowly from the cart when she spots an item she needs. 3 peaches, 4 red apples, 5 bananas, a package of chocolate chip cookies, a bunch of collard greens, a carton of orange juice. I straighten the crooked cart that Ma always leaves in the middle of an aisle. Hold my pocketbook. Watch my pocketbook. My mother chides me loudly when she wobbles from the cart. Smashed inside her pocketbook are those wipes and tissue and cash and coins and her food stamp card and clipped coupons, lots of clipped coupons, and her crinkled grocery list, neatly written in blue ink. Ma has the list mainly in her head, but sometimes glances at it when her memory is a throwback to the beautiful little dark-skinned black girl on that porch in South Carolina. But they did not tell little dark-skinned girls that they were beautiful back then. Ma thought only white people and light-skinned black people were good-looking. They did not tell little dark-skinned girls they could be anything. So Ma thought her life was munching the raccoon meat her desperate father shot and skinned. Life was Daddy beating her and her 3 sisters and brother and her mother as if they were slaves on an auction block. Because life for every black was one big beating. Mom thought life was signs and railroad tracks that could go where she could go, was what her slip joints could not do, was being branded tar baby and spade and jigaboo and spare chucker and ugly, real ugly, by the local white folks and the local Negroes too, just because she was born tobacco brown like James Brown. Ma ain't know nothing about no sexism and no classism. Ma ain't know nothing about bell hooks or Toni Morrison or Alice Walker. But she knew she was Celie before Celie was Celie in the color purple. This God is why to this day I believe my mother loves Whoopi Goldberg, because when Ma sees Whoopi in the movies, she sees herself crashing through the broken glass of a dream deferred. This God is why black people got therapy sessions we name field hollers, spirituals, the Underground Railroad, the blues, jazz, church, dance, the Chitlin Circuit, prayer circles, funk, hip-hop, Holy Ghost, barbershops, hair salons, Black Twitter, talking in tongues, laughter, the soul food we squeeze between our chained ankles and transmitted with us from Africa to them plantations. Ma be saying, we don't know nothing about no Africa. We ain't African. Ma don't know Africa all up in her. Whenever she talks about the fish she's going to lather and fry, about chocolate cake, she's secretly crowned with pecans, about potato salad, she will punctuate with sweet pickles, about wild and buttery cornbread surrounded and lasted from scratch. Food is my mother's best friend, because my mom ain't got no friends except her sister Kathy and me. Food is my mom's best friend, but the food has left her body wretched, like the planet, with diabetes, with high blood pressure, with mysterious things she won't discuss. Dear mother, you are real mysterious with all those doctor visits, like you're a bow-legged root woman plotting potions while lurking behind a sable palm tree. Dear mother, you are real mysterious with the inflamed whip marks of your past, held hostage in your bedroom drawer. Dear mother, you are real mysterious while heavy living room curtains smother your sunlight and your loneliness, but you are not alone. We are moon twins, emotionally eating our way to the promised land. You told me food is your happiness. You begged me not to take away your happiness. I will not, mother, I will not. I see your beauty and your genius in the way you boil the water, in the way you season the food, in the way you create kitchen magic as you did when I was a boy. I smell the joy on your house dress. I feel the joy when you crunch and chew. I sense the divine when you suck on that chicken bone. And I know when the time comes for God to look herself in the mirror, she will see you.
You're listening to Kevin Powell, who was reading his title poem, Grocery Shopping with My Mother. Um, Kevin, your poem immediately made me think of The Color Purple by Alice Walker before you even mentioned Celia in your poem when you write, Dear God. At the same time, your poem places me inside many black homes. What did God and religion mean to Kevin Powell? And how is your mother's conversation with God different from your conversation with God?
Woo. My conversation with God was like James Baldwin's conversation with God, even as a child. I mean, we grew up, oh my God, Ethelbert Miller, you're a New Yorker, so you remember Reverend Ike. You remember Uptown.
Right.
So Reverend Ike is actually from the same hometown in South Carolina as my mother. So we went to two churches. I was born and raised in Jersey City. I've lived in Brooklyn for 30 plus years, but we went to church in Newark, New Jersey, which was a Pentecostal Holy Roller church. And then we went to church in Uptown, Washington Heights, I guess it is now, Reverend Ike's church. And he was a televangelist. He was a mega church preacher before those were even terms, I guess, And so I was confused. I understood, when you think about poor people, including poor people of color, we're just trying to find hope anywhere we can. And so we prayed a lot. There were prayer cloths and there was talking in tongues and, but I also remember us giving a lot of money to the preachers. And that, even as a child, 7, 8, 9 years old, and I talk about it in my autobiography, The Education of Kevin Powell, I have a whole chapter called Church. Something felt wrong about it. And I remember years later when I got to college and I read Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, in his second essay, where he talked about, this God is not working, maybe we need to find a new God. I understood exactly what he was talking about because on a simple level, faith was critical. I wouldn't be here, I believe, if it wasn't for the faith that my mother had to hold us together because it's you're from an urban environment. It is tremendously difficult. And faith saved my life. Books in the library saved my life. I mean, that was as important to me, I feel, as God, just falling in love with reading as a child and one day realizing maybe I can do something as a writer. But it's something that drove us. But as I got older, I began to realize that there's something to this. And, the reason why I referenced The Color Purple is two reasons. One, my mother really does love Whoopi Goldberg, and she does represent something to her as a fellow dark-skinned black woman, seeing the beauty and the magic of someone succeeding who looks like her. And then also just how the story was written. It touched my heart, the journey of Celie and the references to God throughout The Color Purple. And so that definitely was a sample, as we would say in hip-hop, and a homage, a tipping of the cap to Alice Walker, because that story had such a profound effect on me when I first read it.
Mm-hmm. You made reference in your remarks just now to James Baldwin, and I believe, even though you associate with Brooklyn, but I remember you moving up to Harlem one time.
Twice. I lived in Harlem twice, actually. I went to Harlem first. When I crossed the river, I actually lived on Riverside Drive and also lived on Edgecombe Avenue the second time. So I went to Harlem because of the Harlem Renaissance. Even though it was the 1990s, early 1990s, in my mind was like, that's where Zora and Langston went. That's where Malcolm X preached. That's where I need to be. Mm-hmm. But as you recall, in the 90s, there was this whole flood of writers and artists that were flocking to Brooklyn, and that's how I ended up mostly being in Brooklyn because there was an energy that was happening there. But it was definitely Harlem first. I love Uptown. Uptown is very important to me for so many different reasons. And as you know, like you are, I'm a lifelong baseball fan, so I was like, I'll be close to Yankee Stadium, too. I can go to the baseball game.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to ask you a very important question. It gets back to the poem that you wrote about your mother. How has being a caretaker for your mom changed you? And you talk about you and your mother never hugged or said, I love you. And I just wonder, okay, having gone through that, growing up with your mom, and then now you're the caretaker.
It's been a profound transformation. I mean, the way this book even came about, grocery shopping with my mother, I literally had to take her grocery shopping because there was a point where she could not even go by herself because of the difficulty of walking. thankfully she's much better now. There's definitely been a lot of prayers and a lot of healing. But I would walk behind her crying because I was terrified, one, of losing my mother. And then two, there's the traumas, as I talked about in the email to you. I'm an only child. I was raised by my mother. I didn't really know my father at all. I only saw him 3 times from the time I was born until when I was 8 years old, and then he disowned us. He just cut us off. They were never married. He just disappeared. Never saw him again. And so it's a very complex relationship between my mother and me. You know what I'm talking about. It's multi-layered. And, I had to process all of that. But thankfully, Ethelbert, I've been going to therapy for over 30 years since I was a very young man. And part of the therapy, and when I say therapy, definitely a counselor, literally a counselor, but I believe that writing is a form of therapy. I think writing is a way for us to make a sense of all this stuff. I think it was Baraka that said poetry is a way of making sense of the chaos of the world, something to that effect. And that has helped me to process my mother. But also because I've traveled extensively, I've been to the Caribbean, to Latin America, to the South. I've gotten to look at things within a set of adult eyes to help me to make sense of it. And just knowing our history the history that I've learned helped me to put my mother in context. Like, okay, she had to deal with racism and sexism and classism, and she was born in segregated America, and she was a part of the migration from the South to the North. What traumas did she have? What did she have to deal with? You know what I mean? When my mother would say things to me when I was growing up as a little boy, don't be like your father, or all men are no good, I didn't understand how to process that. But years later, as I began to study feminist literature, Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and folks like that, I was like, I now have a context because of the literature that exists around me to understand why my mother has operated the way she did. So it's been a lot, and we still grapple.
Right. You have something that's different from me, Kevin Powell. I've always written about the silence between me and my father, but you write about the silence between mothers and sons. Talk about that.
You said you always written about the
silence between me and my father, but you write about the silence between you and your mother.
I wish I knew my father, Ethelbert. Wow. And as you know,
we gotta say that because even some people who know their fathers are present, but there's no conversation. Like, for example, I always write about the fact that, I was very fortunate to have my father, living with me, but my father was always working. So my image of my father was a man sleeping, but, I had a roof over my head, so I'm always grateful for my father. What he, I tell people I never worked as hard as my father, but there was a silence that was there.
It's interesting, and people like you and I get to break that silence. I think that, as you know, a lot of us who are men, who identify as men, have been told not to communicate, not to talk about things, and it's really powerful because, I think that poetry has given people like us permission to use our voices in a way maybe that our fathers did not. What you're saying, what's profound about what you're saying, what I found out my father was dead about 10 years after he died, around 2012, 2013, and I found out that he was asking for me. He had about 12 children. He had a lot of children. I was the only one that was born up north. And the thing I kept thinking about is, why did he never communicate, try to reach out? And in fact, my mother had ran into him in the 1990s. She gave him my number, and he never called. And it made what you're saying is really profound, because I think that a lot of us are socialized to believe that men should not talk about what we feel. And this is why I think it's so important that people like you and I exist as poets, especially as men, because it's like, express ourselves. And I think that, my mother had a lot of male energy, and part of it was out of necessity for survival. So because she had to be my mother and my father. In a lot of ways, she was very much like her father, who was a very tough man, and unfortunately, in the world that we've grown, they grew up and they had to be tough or they wouldn't have survived. But there was the absence of communicating about stuff. Like, boy, I don't want to talk about that. Don't bring that up. Don't tell all our business. Why are you writing this book? I've gotten all of that through the years. But I'm like, if we don't talk about it, I think that we end up being stuck in the same place. And I don't want to be stuck in the same place.
Like, well, then I'm going to ask you a question, Kevin.
Yeah.
Because, we were talking about, religion within the home. Would you at a point where you would forgive your father?
It's in the poem. It's in the poem. It's in the poem that's in the book. It's interesting you asked that question. I've been writing about my father since the 1990s in essays and poetry form. And for some reason, when I got to this book, as I was putting the book together, I said, you know what? I just want to forgive my father. I just need to let this go, because I believe that it can do damage to you. It's almost like you're in a box for the rest of your life.
Let me ask you a question again. You are a writer, And many times what happens, people will write about forgiving their fathers, but their heart doesn't turn the page.
You know, it's interesting. Went to, I found my father's gravesite in 2013, 10 years ago, literally this year. And when I got there, Ethelbert, I dropped to my knees and I started crying for someone I didn't even really know. And I started saying that I forgave him. I told him about my life. I just talked to the gravesite and I said, this is what I've been through. I've been looking for a father figure my entire life. I realized I had to be the father that I wanted to see. I had to be the man that I wish he would have been. And that was the beginning of it 10 years ago. I couldn't have written this poem 10 years ago. I had to just go see where I came from. I didn't know anything about him. And over the course of these 10 years, I came to a point where I said, you know, because of the work that I do, as you know, I work with a lot of males of all backgrounds, but especially black males in all ages. And you know that I'm working on a film right now about black manhood, black fatherhood. There's so much hurt out there between men, you know, around their fathers. I'm talking about folks who had fathers and folks who did not have fathers, because I see it in the film. We have 60 black males in the film, and it's like, there's some real painful stuff. And I think, again, the beauty of being a writer like you are, like I am, is that we get to express this stuff. And so many of us don't feel like we even have an outlet to talk about this. And so I believe that we have to create what we want to see, like Toni Morrison said. We have to create what we want to see. And I'm like, Kev, you know what's happening out here. You have to be the kind of man who actually is willing to talk about everything. And you also have to be about forgiveness. It can't just be the women. You know, as a straight man, it can't just be brothers and sisters who are queer, LGBTQ+, who seem to be more in touch with the emotions. You as a straight man especially have a responsibility to try to break out of this prison, this male prison that James Baldwin talked about. That's what it is for me.
Well, let's talk about another issue which you raised in the poem that people heard. Talk about the issue of color within the black community. You touch on this in your poem when you write about your mother and how she was treated.
Wow. Well, I can tell you that I hated myself as a black person. I'm not even a dark-skinned black person. My father was very fair-skinned or light-skinned or red-bone or whatever terms that we use in the black community, as you know.
Right.
And my mother was dark-skinned. I didn't even think my own mother was beautiful growing up, because I was told that anything that was darker than me was not attractive, was ugly. Again, this is part of the educational system. This was the white Jesus in the churches. This was the, you know, Superman figures that we saw. Everything that was beautiful was white, and everything that was negative was black or dark complexion. And so it's profound, and it exists to this day, as you well know, in so many different spaces, you know. And I think that it did major damage to me. And it wasn't, again, until I started to read black literature and read black history. And I'm not just talking about American literature and American history, but just diasporically, just reading as much as I could get my hands on. That changed me, because I realized that I had been taught basically black self-hatred. And that's something that I fight against. I mean, as much as I love to write about a range of things, as you know, I have poems in the book about baseball, about the Beatles and things like that. A lot of it comes back to what I decided when I was 18 years old as a freshman, first-year student at Rutgers, is that I want to tell the truth and I want to practice self-love. And I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I got to keep digging. And part of it has to be the art that I help to create. That's what it is for me.
Right. Well, you know, your poem speaks directly also on the issue of food and diet and how it affects our community. Link this issue to your civil and human rights work. How do we get our black community to eat better and avoid the health issues that continue to plague us, especially when certain foods just seem to bring us joy eating?
Well, you know, it's an interesting question. I go to a black holistic doctor here in Brooklyn he's an amazing doctor who services folks of all backgrounds. I brought my mother there a few years ago. He had a plan of action for her. I explained to him the context of who she was, how he needed to deliver the information, and my mother listened. And when we left the office, Ethelbert, she said to me, this wonderful Christian woman that she is, I don't give a F what this effer said. I'm going to eat whatever the F I want to eat, because no one's going to take away my happiness. That was jarring to me, you know, because I'm a vegan. I'm plant-based at this stage in my life. My activism work in the communities, not just in New York, but around the country and even globally, I'm in these communities and I'm watching people dying of preventable stuff. You know, I mean, it's profound. No judgment. I get it. I get all the struggles and all the things that come at us from different angles. And so, but, you know, unfortunately, we don't recognize that some of the diets that we have are directly linked to our oppression, going back to those plantations, going through segregation. If you're in America, going through colonization. If you're in Latin America or the Caribbean, it's all connected. And I'm not telling people to change who they are culturally. I think there's a beauty in the food that we eat. I love Caribbean food. I love soul food. I love Spanish food. But I also realize there's different ways that we can prepare it, and that's the challenge for us. And a lot of us think that it's pricey and things like that. It's just really about a shift in our mindset, and that's the biggest challenge, is how do we shift our mindset. So as much as I want to just, be a poet or just be an activist talking about, hey, voting rights, whatever it may be, I realize at a certain point that my work has to be holistic, because otherwise, what's the point of writing a great poem that inspires people or getting people out to vote, and we're getting someone in office who we hope will do the right thing by our communities, but we're dying because of the food that we're eating. And so that also had an effect on how I wrote this book, because I kept thinking holistically, what does this mean for all of us? This is not just about my mother.
Well, let's look at some of the political issues. I recall, I think it was Michelle Obama going down to Mississippi. You have places, especially in the South, where people just are not around where they can get the fresh foods, the foods that they need to eat. It's just, sometimes the stores are not there.
Yeah.
In rural areas, So, you're dealing with that issue.
It's real. It's interesting. You mentioned I lived in Harlem. When I lived in Harlem in the early 1990s, I had to go downtown a little bit to the Upper West Side to actually get to a decent supermarket. That has shifted, as we know, partly because of gentrification. There's a Whole Foods and other stores up there in Harlem now, but even in urban areas, it's been difficult, and that's the conversation piece, because I think, we just celebrated Dr. King's birthday, as you know, and I've been thinking a lot about what he talked about economic justice. I mean, people are foolish if they keep comparing Malcolm and Martin and pitting them against each other. I think they were very complementary to each other, actually. And for me, Dr. King especially resonates when he started to shift towards the Poor People's Campaign to Economic Justice, because he was saying essentially, what does it matter if you can sit at the lunch counter if you have no money to buy a sandwich? What does it matter if you can sit anywhere on the bus if you have no money to get on the bus? And so it's tied to economic justice. And I think that shifted. He died in 1968, 55 years ago. And it's still the same issue of poverty. Most of our folks, particularly black and brown people, the people where we come from, and of course we know there's working class, there's poor white folks in this country who are equally suffering, poor indigenous people, poor Asian people are also suffering. And so the real question for me is, why is it that the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of people? This is what Dr. King was saying. These are not my words, whereas the majority of us are just struggling. And so a lot of my poetry, a lot of my work, one reason why Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes especially, and Baldwin especially, out of all the writers that we've ever had, they appealed to me because I feel like they were speaking for the masses of people, and they were speaking about the concerns of the masses of people, just like Dr. King.
Before we take our break, Kevin Powell, why don't you read, we were just talking about King, why don't you read your love sonnet?
Oh, wow. I'm turning to it right now. I love Pablo Neruda. He's one of my favorite poets ever. And, it's interesting. And I need to give you props on publicly, Ethelbert Miller, for a couple of reasons. One, you don't even know this. I, as a black male writer, have sought out writers that write about love, black writers who write about love, and writers, other than you and Quincy True, I know of no other black male writers who've written about baseball. And, it's crazy, but I think that what you all were saying is that we have permission to write about anything. So this is called a love sonnet. I'm in a beautiful relationship now, thankfully, and I wrote this for her. A love sonnet. I've waited a life for a love like yours. It appeared as a red moon from the south. I feel warm fingers orbiting my pores. I taste joy at the corners of your mouth. I did not know that I was mad hungry, that I was this starved for a simple touch. My love, I must enjoy this reverie. From bone to skin, I adore you so much. Our legs interlace like rope when we rest. Hearts race each other like African drums. I've laid burdens upon the sun's bare chest. I've blown the tops off mountains with your lungs. Together we jump the broom's tulip floor, and when we die, I'll love you even more.
Listening to Kevin Powell reading his love sonnet, which is in his book, Grocery Shopping with My Mother. When you mentioned about the love poem, it's a person who was the influence on me in the late 60s, was Eugene Redmond, poet of East St. Louis. And so he
Yeah.
was always talking about, people were talking about revolution. He was using revolution, saying, well, there's places we got to be talking about love. So Kevin Powell, let me take a break here. My guest today is Kevin Powell. He's a poet, journalist, and filmmaker, human rights activist. His most recent book is Grocery Shopping with My Mother, published by Soft Skull Press. Kevin Powell will be in D.C. Tomorrow. He has a book signing in the evening at Solid State Books at 7 o'clock. Solid State Books is located on 600 F 8th Street Northeast. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The show's On the Margin. The station is WPFW 89.3 FM. We're back on the margin with my guest Kevin Powell. Kevin, in the first half of the show, you mentioned you going to your father's gravesite. In your book, you remember a number of people: Kobe Bryant, Sidney Poitier, also Bell Hooks. I believe you went out to see Bell Hooks before she died. Is that correct, Kevin?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. You went out to see Bell Hooks, if I'm not mistaken.
I did. I literally flew what I found out later was a tornado to get to her, and that was deep. And remember, that was just a week after our brother Greg Tate died. Which,
Right.
man, I wrote a piece about Greg Tate for the Washington Post. People can look up. It's hard, Ethelbert. You get older, you lose people around you, and it's just a profound experience. You start to think about your own mortality a lot. I did not intend on writing a book that would talk about Bell and Kobe Bryant and Sidney Poitier and Cicely Tyson, but these things happened in the course of the 3, 4, 5 years I was putting this poetry book together, and I felt like, I needed to pay homage to folks. Wow. One reason why, we talked about our shared love of baseball. One reason why it was important for me to put things in the book that make me happy, like the baseball, like baseball, like the Beatles, is because I don't want a book that's just mourning people. I need to balance this out a bit if I can, and baseball is my great joy. And again, I want to thank you because I think you may be the only black male writer I know that's written a full book of poems about baseball.
I've written 3.
3. I have 2 of them. Wow.
I've written 3. But I wanted you to talk about we mentioned Bell Hooks and Kobe Bryant. I wanted you to talk about Miguel Algarin. You have and read the poem that you have for him and talk about his influence.
Wow. So way back in 1990. I had been hearing about the New York Poets Cafe. I had read an article in the Village Voice, I believe it was, about Paul Beatty, who was the first poetry slam champion at the New York. And I just said, I got to get there. Again, by that point, 1990, I had studied, the work of your generation. I had studied the Harlem Renaissance and Negritude writers. And Miguel, this is called for Miguel Algarin, 1941 to 2020. Muchas gracias, mi hermano. It's not good enough for you, Senor Miguel Algarin. So I say, yo te amo. And may God, her, the ancestors, them, the universe, it, shovel the heavy sigh from your New York gold and decree to you, there, where you are now, that Puerto Rico is not only gentrified land, but also the original melting pot people that gave us you, Itainos, Africans, Spaniards, Roberto Clemente, salsa, young lords, hip-hop. That you are congas and tongo-tied verses, arroz con pollo and Shakespeare, the Boogaloo and the Lower East Side. Poppy, you are a Boricua poet laureate with a voice like that of an old-school lion god atop a freedom train they call words and feelings. You are Spanish and English ping-ponging Mikey Pinheiro and Nancy Mercado and me, see, la verdad, poor folks like me, slamming off the walls of the New York Poets Cafe. Racism could not stop you. Homophobia could not stop you. El SIDA could not stop you. Being kicked off the board could not stop you. Cultural colonizers could not stop you. Because, mi amigo, your flesh may be of fire and wind and earth now, but your last breath, just like your first, will forever be our Rican and our soul.
Okay, Kevin Powell reading his poem from Miguel Algarin in his book "Grocery Shopping with My Mother." I wanted you to share that because when we look at New York, we're looking at a city with a considerable amount of diversity, and I was just wondering, how do you, as Kevin Powell, how do you migrate the city in terms of Dominicans, Haitians, Koreans? Has that changed for you as a writer and activist that you're more outgoing to other communities?
No, it's funny you asked that question. Started as a child. even though I didn't know anything about Black history growing up in Jersey City, as you know, right across the river from New York, we had a lot of the same communities. So we had African Americans, West Indians, Puerto Ricans. I remember when the wave of Indians from India started coming to Jersey City, there was a Filipino community. And so Jersey City actually prepared me for life in New York. I have a deep love for the Latin American community. That came from my childhood, hearing the music, hearing the smelling the food, hearing the language. I mean, yo hablo español. I speak Spanish because as a kid, I just would sit in front of the TV and watch Sesame Street and Electric Company, and I would imitate them speaking English and speaking Spanish, and then I would listen to my friends speaking Spanish. And so that's the other reason why I sought out the Latinx community, the Hispanic community, the Latino community, whatever folks want to call it, in New York City, and why I ended up in New Yorican, because it just felt natural for me. I didn't realize it as a child, but I was always crossing cultural boundaries, even as a kid, because I was going to integrated schools. Being a product of Generation X, we were the first schools. In Jersey City, they called it open enrollment, but it was basically busing. And so that led to me early on having those kind of relationships. And I love New York for that reason. I mean, you see the poem that I wrote about New York City, I wanted to represent that. That poem was written during
when did you read that poem, Kevin? When did you read that poem for New York?
Let me find it really quickly.
It's on page 71.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. We're in church, Kevin. We're in church.
You know what's funny? Thank you. I don't even know my own book. Thank you.
It's a hymnal. It's not a book. It's a hymnal.
Thank you. For New York City, 1, the Bronx, Richard Avedon, snapshots of prehistoric baseball games and Jewish B-girls and B-boys of summer, Jamaican hills that boogalooed hip-hop and doo-wop dreams double-bagged with Spanish rice and beans. 2, Manhattan, Wall Street, Central Park after dark, African burial ground, and Fate Native American sound, Harlem, a cousin of Chinatown, as Grand Central plays the middle, solving this city's riddle. 3, Queens, fingerprints on South Asian spices and scents, baking inside Irish and Greek stews of suburban hood, shimmies to the graffiti wordplay of Tony Bennett, Cyndi Lauper, and Nicki Minaj. 4, Brooklyn, a bridge begotten by tongues of the world, pride wide like children's eyes at Coney Island, Spike Lee and Rosie Perez craving Italian ices on roasted brownstone stoop. 5, Staten Island, no human is an island, neither is this landmass, Wu-Tang Clan wholly ghosted it, a kung fu flick with ferry boat, and bleached picket fences like its neighbor, Jersey.
Okay, Kevin Powell reading his poem for New York. Kevin, I want you to, you've done something, your career is, you've done a number of things in your career, but there's one thing that I think is very important, and I was looking at it, and it's just amazing because it holds up. And that's your anthology that you did with Ras Baraka, In the Tradition, an anthology of young Black writers. I was just looking at you go back and just look at the contents, the people who are in that book. It's just amazing in terms of where their careers are today. And so I was wondering, talk about your relationship with Ras Baraka, and also how this book was, was developed, the process. Did you ask for work, or did you already know what the work was?
Great question. No one's asked me this question in a long time. This is a great question. Wow. And you're right. I mean, I'm In the Tradition came out, was it 92 or 93? And I mean, Elizabeth Alexander's in the book. Paul Beatty's in the book. I mean, there's some giants.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing book.
Yeah, thank you. And we didn't know what we were doing, to be honest with you. we were kids. We're in our 20s. But what I did know, thanks to Dr. Cheryl Wall at Rutgers, was the New Negro of with Elaine Locke put together during the Harlem Renaissance, and I did know Black Fire anthology, and then I started gathering other Black anthologies that came out of the 60s and early 70s. I was just digesting anthologies, and then I got a hold of the Negritude Writers book, and I was like, I want to do something like this. And I remember that Terry McMillan, she did what was it called, Breaking Ice, if I remember correctly.
Right, Breaking Ice.
And what I remember was that Trey Ellis, who's in our book as well, was the only young writer in the book, younger writers who was born in the 60s or 70s. At that point, we were the new generation. And so I was like, I want to do an anthology. And someone actually sent me, think about it, Ethelbert, this is before social media, this is before email. I literally wrote letters to people all around the country. young writers. I was like, we have this book happening. And would you like to? And I believe that people like Elizabeth had put out the Venus Hottentot already. I
Right.
believe her first
Mm-hmm.
book. And so I would find writers. I would see that they had put a book out, and I would just send them a letter, and they would respond. The Darkroom Collective, all those folks, Sharon Strange, and all
Right.
those great writers from Boston. And what I
Mm-hmm.
remember was that I just wanted to make sure that it covered the whole country. We got writers from L.A., from the South, and
So what was the relationship between you and Ross Baraka?
well, our college careers overlapped because we were both student leaders. He was a student leader at Howard University. I was at Rutgers. But just as I was also leaving Rutgers, Amir Baraka came in for a year or two to teach. I did an interview with Baraka. I need to find that audio tape. It's somewhere. I still have it. And that began a relationship. And I also lived in Newark for a couple of years before I moved over to New York. So I had become very close with Amina and Amiri and Ras, and that's how it happened. And I just said, well, Ras, we could be like Larry Neal and Baraka, and we could do this. And he said, okay, and that's how it happened. And what I remember is we had a hard time finding a publisher because people were like, no. But thankfully, if you remember Glenn Thompson, Harlem Room Press.
Oh, Glenn Thompson, right? Yeah.
Glenn believed in us. Glenn, rest in peace. May he rest in peace.
Major loss
Yeah.
right there.
Yeah, and he's the one who published the book for us. And we had a huge event at New York University, I remember, and it was like 35 of the writers. I think it was 50 writers in the book showed up.
Mm-hmm.
It was incredible, and I'm stunned at people pulling the book out. There's not very rare few places, even if I'm on this poetry tour, someone will reference in the tradition 30 years later, and I'm just thankful because we didn't know what we were doing.
But there's you thank a woman. You're just talking about how you put this book together.
Marie Brown.
Marie Brown. I want you to talk about Marie Brown, and you really highlight her in your acknowledgments. What was your relationship with Marie Brown?
Marie Brown was my literary agent. She was like our godmother, and she really taught us a lot about the world of publishing. I mean, I because of Marie Brown, to this day, I pride myself on knowing how the business side of publishing as much as I know how to write a little bit. She stressed that. She really stressed that to us, and the fact that she was really a pioneer, and not just as a black editor. People talk about Toni Morrison as one of the early black editors. Marie Brown was an editor, but she also was one of the first black literary agents, and she really was a champion for us, and she believed in us. We would literally sit in her office on Broadway in Houston in Manhattan, New York City, on the floor, and she would just be there, let us be there. We would go up to her brownstone in Harlem, and she was incredible for us. And I'll tell you a funny story. When myself and Tony Medina, who's there in D.C. at Howard, myself, Tony, Elizabeth Alexander, Willie Perdermo, and some other young writers ended up in France, in Paris. I mean, you may have been there. Were you there in 1992?
No, but
it was a big conference. Skip Gates was there. It was this big conference about black expatriates who were in France, and it was Marie Brown was there, and she tolerated us because we were wild.
Well, I tell you this just for the record, Kevin Powell. The reason why I have a copy of In the Tradition is because, and this is March 2nd, 1993. It's on Marie Brown Associates Stationery. Willie Perdermo sent me a copy of the book.
Are you serious?
Wow. He says here, Dear Ethelbert, I've yet to meet you, but I feel like I know you. Enjoy the In the Tradition. Yours sincerely, Willie Perdermo.
Wow, who is now the poet laureate for the state of New York.
Right. And he was on the show. Sometimes I love Willie. East Harlem there. Kevin, we're running out of time, but I want you to talk about your film When We Free the World, a film about manhood and fatherhood. How did you conceptualize it? And also the decision to go from writing to making films.
Well, I mean, you have been one of the folks that I pay attention to who's written extensively about the black male experience. I'd want to thank you for that publicly as well. And I love cinema. I've loved cinema since I was a child. I mean, between baseball, sitting in front of a TV, and you're a New Yorker, so you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. On the weekends, I was watching Channel 9 and Channel 11 religiously. And what do we have there? Baseball and a lot of old movies. And so I've always loved movies. But somewhere in the last couple of years, I saw Beyonce's Lemonade, I think 2016, 2017. I remember thinking to myself, there needs to be something like this for black males. I didn't know what it was going to be. I had not directed anything that was feature-length ever. I've done a lot of small things, but nothing big. And this is what it's turned into. So literally 4 years, 60 males between the ages of 11 and 90-something are in the film. And it's a deep dive. We deal with manhood, the question of what is a man. We deal with fatherhood. I'm very proud of the fact that it's inclusive. We have straight brothers. We have queer brothers, transgender brothers. We have disabled brothers, formerly incarcerated, college educated. It's a wide range of people. We talk about mental health, suicide. We talk about folks who are survivors of childhood sexual violence. But we also talk about hope. We talk about the importance of brothers, men communicating with each other, where we started the conversation earlier when we were talking about fathers, the importance of talking through stuff and getting help as needed. And, you know, the way I look at it, you would appreciate it's visual poetry. There's animation in the film. We have an original soundtrack, all black male vocalists on the soundtrack.
Well, take me behind the making. Take me into the making of this film. How did you begin to, get your film budget together? Where did you go for money? I remember you trying to raise money online.
Woo!
Talk about that process.
It's been a journey, but I want to thank the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker and the Ford Foundation. I want to thank the Knight Foundation because they've come through big time. But I was begging and pleading. I was using my own money because in my mind, I'm thinking like, well, Melvin Van Peebles did it and Spike Lee did it.
Right. So you had a credit card that got maxed out.
Brother, credit card, debit cards, negative bank balances. I don't advise the way I did it. I think that, but I don't regret it. And then we were doing it through COVID. It started in 2019. A year later, COVID hit. I almost was ready to give up. And I was like, we're not going to there's nothing happening. Everything just dried up. But,
we'll stop there a second because you're talking about not just yourself. How did you get to put together a crew of people to believe in what you want to do and keep them together during a pandemic?
Great question. Just being honest, this is what the film is, and we feel like we want to do something. I mean, look, you referenced Bell Hooks. I was like, this is the kind of film Bell would expect me to make. This is the kind of film Alice Walker and Toni Morrison would expect me to make. Like, how do you digest this work and not say that you want to do something that's a little different that really kind of probes this whole question of manhood? And so people believed in it, and people stuck with us, and we did it in parts. We did shoots originally. We did shoots here and there. We shot stuff on cell phones, on computers, via Zoom, Skype. We literally have pieced this thing together, and it's changed me. It's turned me inside out. This film has seen me go through a divorce. This film has seen me go through depression. The film is dedicated to a young friend of mine who committed suicide in the midst of us making the film, a fellow filmmaker. It's been no joke. It will be out later this year. I can't wait to bring it to Washington where you are and share it with folks. And I think that it will be a conversation piece for many people. And some of the poems in the poetry book, Grocery Shopping, are also in the book. I actually did not want to be in the film. I did not want to be in the film in any way, but we began to realize we need some sort of narrative arc to tie the stories together. So that's where that came about, because I'm not into putting myself out there like that. I'm really not.
Well, let's look at the two areas, industry. From some writers, getting published is very, very difficult. Knowing what you've done in terms of being a writer, compare it to the film industry, because now you have a film. How are you going to get it into, I guess, the film festivals? How are you going to get it into people seeing it? Talk about those challenges.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't say to you, congratulations on the Grammy nomination. Congratulations.
Okay, thanks.
That's big. But I bring that up for a reason. From your own journey that we have to diversify as writers. I mean, I had when I was in college, I had Dr. Arnold Rampersad as a professor.
Oh, you had a good professor.
Yes, who wrote the 2-volume biography on Langston Hughes. And what I did, I digested that book, and I said, okay, Langston was born in 1902. He died in 1967. He wrote professionally for over 40 years. The only thing I remember thinking as a young writer, I've got to be able to be in a lot of spaces, because this is a marathon. As you know, Ethelbert, this is a marathon. And it's hard because I've had lots of money in my life. I've been completely broke. In my life, I have filed bankruptcy twice. I'm being really honest with you here. It is difficult being a writer. It's difficult being an artist in this society. And yes, we have grants and fellowships, and we've been blessed, like I said, with the film over the last couple of months with some beautiful support. But I just, you have to believe that what you're doing, as you know, is so important and necessary to get out there, that it's as important to you as breathing. You figure out a way, but it's hard. I mean, there have been times when I have not had a publisher. There have been times when I've not had a literary agent at all. I don't have a literary agent right now, in fact.
But Kevin, I'm going to take you back, because you may not remember this. But what happened, you were one of the few writers at a point, and I remember you were down, you may not recall this, we were down, you here in D.C., and you were being recognized in the street because I think it was like MTV. At one time the only writers that people would recognize would be like James Baldwin and Maya Angelou, but people was like, oh, that's Kevin Powell.
I remember that. Yeah.
Right. So I'm wondering and this is very important, because I look at people like Entezaki Shangali, being successful at a certain point in your life and career. How do you handle that so that you're not, like Zora Neale Hurston at the end of her career?
You're asking so many great questions. I really appreciate this conversation. Wow. It's hard. It's hard. I achieved a lot of attention very young in my 20s. And then the 90s for us as Black writers in America was like the Harlem Renaissance of the Black arts movement. But by 30, I had burnt out and I crashed and burned. And I, you asked me about diet and health. I was drinking then. I don't drink anymore. I became a vegan. But I just, it's hard. And I was never comfortable at the part with the celebrity part of it. I'm still not, to be honest with you. I'm still not, because nothing really prepares you for it. When you see all these stories about the Whitney Houstons and the Janis Joplins and the Jimi Hendrix and folks like that, the same thing applies, if we're honest about a lot of writers. They get, I remember being a curator for the Black Arts Festival in Atlanta in the 90s, and it was stunning to me to see how many writers had major drug or alcohol problems. We're not going to say the names of them, but you know what I'm talking about, because It's very stressful. Yeah. It's very stressful. And so I'm proud. I'm happy to still be here. I'm trying not to get emotional here. I'm happy to still be here. It's been tremendously hard, but I encourage folks to do it no matter what, if they really believe in it. When COVID hit in 2020, I started a writing workshop online, and we have 1,400 people in our Facebook group, Kevin Powell's Writing Workshop, because of that. Many of them just want to write. And so I realized at a certain point, just like we have a responsibility. If we're able to survive all kinds of madness and people disrespecting us and not supporting us the way we think we should be supported, if we're still here, we're miracles at the work. We're miracles.
We're a miracle, and if people want to experience the miracle, they can see Kevin Powell tomorrow. Kevin Powell tomorrow. He'll be at Solid State Books celebrating the publication of a new book, Grocery Shopping with My Mother, which was published by Soft Skull Press. Solid State Books is located at 600 F H Street Northeast, and that's tomorrow, January 20th, and that program with Kevin Powell will start at 7 p.m. and he'll be there to continue this conversation. Okay, any one last thing you want to say, Kevin?
My poem called Baseball would not exist without your poetry books and Quincy Truth's poetry on baseball. I just think that.
Well, Quincy's dad was like a Hall of Famer for the Negro Baseball League.
That's right.
And so.
But it matters because I looked for and I said, okay, someone has given me permission to do this because they've done it. So again, just thank you.
Well, the other big, if you run into him, the other big baseball fan is Chris Rock.
That's right.
Chris Rock's another big baseball fan.
That's right.
All right. So, okay, we got to get ready because spring training's coming up. So you and I, the pitchers and the catchers, have to report soon. So I want to thank you for being on my show, okay?
Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
My guest today has been Kevin Powell. He is a poet, journalist, filmmaker, and human rights activist. As I mentioned, he was reading today from Grocery Shopping with My Mother. So, my name is Ethelbert Miller. The show's On the Margin. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.